Thanks so much, Jesse, for all your help today. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here, and then also in the chat, I will point you toward where you can find a copy of these online. They're both in the conference app, and then I put a copy up in Google Drive if that's easier. And then I also put a link to the Text Recycling Research Project's website, which I'll be referencing throughout our conversation today. So first of all, just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for taking time out of your day to come and join us and think with us about text recycling. We're really excited to talk about this topic at this conference because text recycling truly is an issue and a practice that goes across disciplines. And so we hope the presentation today is useful to you as writers, as instructors, and as administrators, so in your many roles. If I can move forward here, I want to share the conference land acknowledgement before we move forward, and I want to start by saying that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tongva peoples, and I want to recognize the Tongva as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land, and thank them for their strength, perseverance, and resistance. I'll just give you here an outline of where we're going to go today. This is going to be a big overview of a big project, and hopefully plenty of time left to see what kinds of questions and areas of interest you have as pertains to this project. So I'll start off by introducing the Text Recycling Research Project and giving a few keywords and definitions that we've developed in this work that'll be important to understanding the presentation today. And then I'll start off by talking about some of our initial research into attitudes and beliefs towards text recycling among academic researchers. I'll hand things over to Chris. He'll finish up talking about that part by sharing some current research that he's working on in that wing of the project. And then he'll move into talking about text recycling analytics. And then Michael Pemberton will pick up talking about implications and outcomes for academic editing and publishing across disciplines, as well as for WACWID classrooms and writing centers. And then hopefully we'll have, as I said, plenty of time to talk. So to introduce you to this project, as I said, I put the website in the chat, but in case you came in afterwards, you've got the website here. This is a project that's now starting its 5th year, which is a little hard for me to believe as a participant, but we've got 4 years of work behind us, and it has been supported by an NSF grant that we're very appreciative for. Couldn't have possibly done all this work without that support. I want to acknowledge the team. Our lead PI, Carrie Moskowitz, isn't part of today's presentation, but certainly he's the animating force of the Text Recycling Research Project. Chris, Michael, and I are co-PIs along with Ian Anson, and then we have several other contributors, Agnes Gamble, David Hansen, Mitch Yelverton, who are part particularly of the legal wing of the project. So I also want to just give a brief thanks to our advisory board that we've put together over the last year or so. And this is a group of professionals in academic ethics and publishing who've been advising us as we move into the phase of the project where we're developing resources for academic publishers and researchers and instructors. And I just want to say a word of thanks to that group. The goals that this project set out with from the start, we imagined this as 2 phases at least. And the first phase was to really undertake research on text recycling. There just wasn't very much empirical research or any research at all on this topic. There was, of course, existing writing on self-plagiarism. The territory wasn't completely underexplored, but there just wasn't much empirical research. So we mapped out these 3 areas we were interested in. We'll be talking about some of the results of those studies today: beliefs and attitude, text analysis, and legal analysis. But we also knew from the start that we'd want to create some research-based guidelines and policies on text recycling for publishers and authors and instructors and students, and even for academic ethics offices and folks like that. So we always had this both a research goal and a very pragmatic goal of making our research actionable for academic writers. So moving into some of our key terms and definitions, I want to start with the definition of text recycling. So I've been using that term so far, but it deserves definition. And so you may be more familiar with the term self-plagiarism. That's one that we wanted to set aside because, of course, it's already freighted with an ethical judgment of the practice. And that's not very helpful because text recycling is a practice that's sometimes ethical, sometimes not. It's sometimes legal, and it's sometimes not. So we wanted to have a neutral term and and text recycling was the one that we decided made the most sense. And our current definition of this, which has evolved a little bit over the project, and really got to give a lot of credit to Carrie for developing this, is that text recycling is the reuse of textual material, prose, visuals, or equations in a new document where the material in the new document is identical to that of the source or substantively equivalent in both form and content. The material is not presented in the new document as a quotation via quotation marks or block indentation, and at least one author of the new document is also an author of the prior document. So when we're talking about text recycling, we're not talking about plagiarism. That's a whole other world we're setting aside. We're talking about reusing something that you wrote in the past, although authorship is complicated here, right? Particularly in fields where several or sometimes dozens of people author a document and not all of the same people author the next document down the road. So I do have a citation here of a piece that Carrie wrote on the complications of defining text recycling. If you are keen to get into those weeds, he's gotten into them and done a great job in that piece. Next, I want to talk about some more granular definitions. So text recycling itself, I gave you a broad definition, but as we worked on this project, we realized this is one of those topics that maybe seems a lot simpler than it is. Maybe that's every topic out there. Once you really start thinking about things, you realize they're all complicated. And this was one where we realized there are different types of text recycling, and we lacked terminology for disambiguating them, and that terminology is actually really crucial both for our research and our ability to create policies and guidelines for academic writers. So I'm going to talk about the 4 terms we came up with to define different modes of text recycling. So the first is developmental recycling. That's the reuse of material from unpublished documents. So this is common in our research, as we all know. It's generally considered acceptable. So examples of this might be something like, taking a figure from a conference poster and reusing it when you write a journal article about that topic, or taking part of a project description from a grant proposal and reusing it in another grant proposal or in a journal article later on. Generative recycling is the reuse of portions of a previously published document in a new work that makes an original intellectual contribution that's clearly distinct from that of the source. So whether or not this kind of recycling is ethical or legal depends on the specifics of the case. So examples here would be something like if you had a description of a methodology or an instrument in a journal article, and you were working on another project where you used a similar method or the same instrument, you wanted to repeat that language in the new journal article. That's a form of generative recycling. Another form would be if you've got a really great description of a research site where you've done multiple studies, you publish that in a conference proceedings, in a journal article, you want to use it in a future journal article. Can you keep reusing that language, or do you have to change it? So generative recycling and developmental recycling, but especially generative, is what we've put a lot of time into thinking about, because that's where a lot of the ethical questions come up. We have 2 other terms that are important, though, that I want to mention. One is adaptive publication. So this is the republication of an entire document or its central parts, but modified to fit a different context. So the new context may, for example, be different in its target audience, a different language or expertise in the audience, or in its genre. And whether or not adaptive publication is ethical or legal depends both on obtaining publisher permission as well as transparency with editors and readers. So adaptive publication, if you publish something in a German academic journal and then you want to bring it to an English audience and you translate the piece, that's an example. Another example might be if you wanted to reuse material from a journal article in an opinion column. So you're really changing who the piece is for. Finally, duplicate publication is a term that will be more familiar. This is the publishing of work that's the same in genre, content, and audience as a previously published source document. It's widely considered unethical, of course, and in most publication situations, it would be illegal as well, whether it's copyright infringement or a violation of author-publisher agreements. So I know that's a lot to absorb, especially for folks who may not have come into contact with this topic before. So I would just tell you to focus more, I think, on those first 2 points of developmental recycling. When can can authors reuse things that they haven't previously published in their future work? And then generative recycling, when can they reuse things they have published before, parts of those texts? All right, so I'm going to start by reviewing some of the research that we did on attitudes about text recycling and the beliefs that those attitudes are grounded in. I'm going to go through this first part relatively quickly because I want most of our time today to be spent on our more recent work. And the work I'm going to go over here quickly is consists of things that we've published about. So if anything really piques your interest, you can go to our website. The website has links to all of this work. So I'm not going to go into it at the full depth that we could. So one of our first projects was a survey of journal editors and board members, editorial board members from across disciplines. We were interested in how gatekeepers thought about text recycling, and our methods really had us picking from the very top journals in an array of fields, and had over 300 respondents to this. And you can see the citation here where we published the results. I'll just highlight a few of our findings, which included that many of these gatekeepers thought at least some text recycling was a valid writing practice. So that was a big finding at first, just to realize sometimes text recycling is something that's a legitimate writing practice, and the editors and board members at top journals think that that's the case. We also saw, though, a lack of consensus about key situations and issues, things like, can you recycle methods from one journal article to another? That's something that you might have guessed or hoped there'd be a consensus about, that we would all agree you either can't do that or you can do it, or you would see that in the field of biology, they agree that you can, and in the field of literary studies, they agree that you can't. That wasn't the case, and the consensus, there was a broad lack of consensus in many of these issues, and again, detailed more in the paper. All of these variables were salient ones. So where is the source of the text? Where is its location in the text, the source and the destination? What's the rhetorical function? What's it doing, particularly in the new paper? And what are the authorship conditions? So are the authors exactly the same in source and destination? We found that discipline played some role, or there were some measurable differences in disciplinary beliefs, but not holistically, and it wasn't predictive of overarching values and beliefs in the way that we thought it might be. So for example, we found humanists were more amenable to recycling between abstracts of published papers than were scientists, which was kind of interesting. But also there you've got the variable that not all humanities journals require abstracts. Abstracts are quite important in STEM fields, and actually you can publish them individually. So there's more maybe to be investigated there, but again, we just weren't seeing that clustering that we expected. Briefly want to gloss that we followed up with interviews with journal editors, 21 different editors that we interviewed, and found much of the same things that we found in the survey, which was a nice confirmation of that earlier work. I'll just gloss a couple of these things here. Originality was very important, but how editors defined originality wasn't always consistent, and that wasn't something that they were publicly communicating necessarily to authors, that they would have a way of knowing. Editors were not generally very concerned about developmental recycling, that kind of recycling from things that hadn't been published. But one of the things that's interesting is, what do you consider to have been published and not to have been published? And that there's a lot of ambiguity there as well. And our guidelines deal with that, that Michael will be talking about. We also found that editors are risk averse. One wouldn't be surprised to learn. And so they were advising authors to patch write their own prior work just to avoid the appearance of impropriety. So changing out some of your own words, which is a really interesting thing to think about. Like, why are we doing this? Is that more ethical? Does it promote clarity of communication? Our opinion is, in most cases, no, it does not. And that's something where we want to see some clearer guidelines for authors. Finally, I just want to touch on an interesting result from this survey, and Carrie did the survey in this case of novice and expert STEM researchers, and he gave them scenarios to look at. And the one thing I want to highlight here was that 2/3 of the experts and 90% of novices agreed they would benefit from explicit instruction regarding the ethics and conventions of text recycling for scientific writing. So we thought that was great, and that really opens up the opportunity for our recommendations and guidelines to be meaningful for folks. And here I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about a current project that he's working on.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can you all hear me? Thanks to all of you for coming. I also want to make a brief land acknowledgement that's in the chat. I want to honor the land on which North Carolina State University sits, which was originally stewarded by two indigenous tribes, the Tuscarora and the Catawba. We honor these people today by recognizing them in order to break the cycle of colonization and the continued erasure of indigenous and Black peoples. So thank you. So we're now starting to shift some attention toward the practice of text recycling by students and how instructors feel about those practices. And in this context, the definition of text recycling is very similar to the one that we've been using in professional and academic contexts. Student text recycling is the reuse of all or part of the material from one's own document in a new document in which the material is not identified as a quotation or as coming from the previous document. But there are differences as well. So examples of TR in student work include, for example, submitting the same paper in two different courses, or copying parts of a paper written in one course into a paper written in a different course. Go ahead and advance there, Suzanne, thank you. So recently I created a Qualtrics survey to tap into attitudes towards, instructor attitudes toward text recycling. And this was administered internationally on various listservs. Currently, I have a few more than 270 completed surveys, but what I want to discuss here are the results from about 165 surveys or so. I haven't seen any significant differences in the patterns with the more recent results, but they're obviously more robust. So the survey asked for some demographic information, including how long the respondent had been teaching, their discipline, the students they teach most often, that is undergraduate or graduate, or equal amounts of both, what country they teach in. And then that's followed by a kind of benchmark question about their concerns about student plagiarism. Not about text recycling, but how worried are you about plagiarism? They then get 5 realistic scenarios, each of which describes a different kind of student text recycling. And that ranges from a full paper being submitted in another course, let's say, to 2 paragraphs from one paper being sort of repurposed in another. And each question has a text box then for explanation. So there are also qualitative data that need to be coded. And there's also then a narrative text box for them at the end to describe any experiences that they've had with student text recycling. So today I want to share just some very broad results from the survey to illuminate the similarities and differences between professional/academic contexts and the context of instruction. So go ahead and advance if you would there. But first, please feel welcome to take the survey. You can write down this URL, tinyurl.com, 3 lowercase e, 6 lowercase YYPAR. We'd love to have your additions. I don't think, we talked a little bit about this. I don't think sharing a little bit of this is going to really have any effect. Some researchers might disagree, but I don't think so. On your own, just answering honestly your perspectives on this. So go ahead and click again. Suzanne, thanks. So the results for each of the scenarios, first of all, varied quite a bit in terms of the acceptance of TR. So there's definitely something going on with the nature and context of the TR and the type of TR being considered. Overall, one group of respondents is really quite opposed to TR in most forms. A pattern of reasons emerged from their responses, focusing on an assumed problem that student TR causes them to lose opportunities for learning. Others focus on a concern that students should always be evaluated on the basis of new work, not old work. And that also took the form of sort of doubling up on grades, which I think is a kind of parallel to the professional response that scholars shouldn't be, we heard this a lot, they shouldn't be doubling up on their citations. They're sort of cheating professionally by repurposing work. And And then some see student TR as the same as plagiarism or not allowed in any form or as a kind of academic misconduct. Then there's another group that takes a really permissive stance toward TR. And the reasons that they give are quite interesting. Some said that students own their own work. It's their copyrighted stuff and they should be able to do what they want with it, even in an educational setting. Some think students who economize by using work more than one context are actually being smart, kind of like finding a sneaky way to reduce your tax burden that's not quite illegal, right? And others think that repurposing text is generally okay and just should be encouraged. We don't really have a big problem with that. The largest group were more ambivalent, and that matches our professional group. The issues were more contingent, kind of depends on how much is text recycled. It depends on whether the new paper is a different genre than the previous one. And this comes up very often, whether either or both instructor gives permission. And then finally, how different the material is from the original. If it's a different paper, then maybe some material can be recycled. So what we're seeing so far in the results are almost a mirror of what we've seen on the professional side, with two exceptions. First, the concern for student learning. Again, a kind of instructional parallel to editors' concerns for scholars teaching us something new. And second, the purposes of evaluating student work. And the parallel here is, again, something like concern for capitalizing on existing work. We have lots of work to do with the interviews, with coding and so forth, but those are some general patterns that we've seen. Okay, so now back to the first part of the study, the professional part, which is, I want to say a few things about the analytical side of the study. And the question here is not about attitudes, but about actual practices of text recycling. Does it really happen, and how does it happen? So go ahead and click, Suzanne. So to answer this question, we realized that we didn't have the personnel or time or energy to compare hundreds and hundreds of articles, line by line, to find examples of TR. So my son, Ian is an associate professor of political science at UMBC, and he's a tech whiz and a co-PI in the project. It's point of personal privilege. Very proud of him. He created a unique algorithm for this project, and the specifics of that are detailed in some articles, one of which I'll cite shortly. But essentially, this works on a sentence level basis, based on term position, term pattern matching, and term similarity. And it relies on a kind of a set of edit distance methods to generate a composite TR score, which is a fancy way of saying that we tried to determine the strength of TR across articles based on text replication. And we had to test this algorithm and keep refining it. And so we used human scored training sets, the ones we did ourselves painstakingly, tested the algorithm until it got really, really good. At least as good as what we were doing. And you can see the classification precision there. That F1 index is an index of false positives and negative positives, and false and negatives, you know what I'm saying, which does more, it identifies more false negatives than false positives, because we wanted to be sure that it wasn't over analyzing, coming up with results that said there was more text recycling than there wasn't. Okay, next slide. So we had to have a corpus, and we chose 4 research areas in STEM, generalized disciplinary areas of biological sciences, engineering, math and physical sciences, and social, behavioral, and economic. And then we had 2 sort of more specific areas within each of those to create the corpus. Go ahead and click. And so here you can see what we did was we took those 8 NSF research areas. We found 10 grants in each of those, and then 5 papers per grant. So if there were fewer papers, we just tossed it out. We needed at least 5 papers per grant to do the analysis. So we ended up with 400 papers, or 80 sets of 5, so that we could look across the papers to see if there were cases of text recycling. They're all coming from the same projects. Wanted to see if people were replicating material there. So that was the corpus. Go ahead and click, Suzanne. Very quickly, a couple of results. First of all, we predicted that there might be a trailing off of text recycling as the articles were published. That wasn't the case. So you can see here in this orange box, you can see that is that is an index of the amount of text recycling that occurred in paper number 2, was published second. And you can see that in the green box, that's the amount of text recycling that was published in paper number 3 and so forth. So that's one issue, is we're seeing a mix and match kind of process. Doesn't matter so much about when the article is published in the series. Go ahead and click. And then we also were curious with the fields. We wondered that maybe, some generalized disciplinaries would do this more than others. These are not statistically significant, and so we have a little bit more in engineering, a little bit more in social behavioral, but not by much. It's happening in all these fields. So go ahead and click again. So here's what we've learned from the corpus analysis, just very generalized. First of all, text recycling is widespread across disciplines, but it's not practiced universally. It doesn't happen every single time in every single grant. Although there's variation in the intensity of TR across publications from grants in different fields, we don't see any evidence that it's being practiced more often in some areas than others. And although we might expect TR to decrease in subsequent articles, as I said, it appears between all combinations. And there's you have these slides in WOVA, and you can go to that article. I think that's probably the best one to look for the details of the analysis part of the grant. Okay.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to be talking a little bit about implications, outcomes, policies, and guidelines, probably more about policies and guidelines, because that's the focus of much of the work that we've been producing recently. And it's also some of the work that some of our outside advisors are especially interested in, and is one of the focuses of the research project overall. If you can click on the next slide. We've officially moved into phase 2, which is generating policy and guidelines documents. And one of the things that we discovered very quickly, especially after talking with members of our advisory board, was that we had multiple audiences that had some distinctly different needs when it came to talking about how best to use text recycling and when is it best to avoid text recycling. One of those audiences had to do with researchers and scholars who were writing up some of their research for publication. And our goal was to provide them with some guidelines and policies that would be immediately useful to them in thinking about those issues and making decisions about the extent to which they would be recycling some of their own texts when they're getting ready to submit manuscripts for publication. The second audience that we had in mind was editors and publishers, who have the same kinds of concerns that researchers do about what's appropriate or inappropriate when it comes to recycling text, but they also have some unique features, such as communication with the authors and the extent to which authors should transmit information about the extent of text recycling. They're concerned about issues of copyright. They're concerned about issues of the reputation of the journal. So on the one hand, they're looking for some very clear guidance, but they also want some reassurance that the policies that they put into place are not going to cause them problems legally or otherwise down the road. And then the third audience is students, and this gets into the development of educational materials that can be used in classrooms, not just for graduate students, but for undergraduate students as well, and to get instructors and teachers, especially in the STEM fields, to think very critically and usefully about how they want to inform their students about these practices and the extent to which they might want to allow or disallow them in classroom situations, because getting something, using recycled text in a publication is different in some ways from thinking about recycling within the context of a classroom situation. So we wanted to make sure that in all of these documents, we provided clear definitions of text recycling, as well as the categorical terms that Suzanne introduced you to, developmental, generative, adaptive, and duplicate. But more specifically, the focus of this phase is trying to address specific concerns and recommend policies that are based on the research that Susan and Chris have given you overviews of so far. I also similarly want to acknowledge the advisors who have been working with us on this project and helping us to develop some of these policies and guidelines. And as you'll see, if you look at this very brief list, this includes some of the major publishers, such as Taylor and Francis and Springer Nature. It includes MIT Press as well, specific publications such as the Harvard Medical School, British Medical Journal, and PLOS One. And we've also, I want to note, been working very closely with COPE, which is the Committee for the Committee on Publication Ethics. COPE has its own document about text recycling, but it's a document that's specifically aimed towards editors and publishers, not researchers. And it's also a document that in some ways we decided was largely pragmatic and not, at least in its current or early stages, something that was based on research. Okay, you can click, Suzanne. So we've developed recently a number of documents that are intended to identify best practices and also be educational and informative for researchers as well as publishers and editors. The first of these documents that we've produced, and there are links to all of these documents I'm going to discuss on our website, I think as Suzanne has posted. First one is best practices for researchers. Now, our intent was to make this as simple and brief and straightforward as we possibly could. We know that researchers, when they're thinking about what to do with their own texts, want something that doesn't go too deep into the weeds, borrowing from the phrase that Suzanne used, but something that identifies some very specific guidelines that they can use. Now, I also want to say that this is a document that exists in a native HTML format, so that if you go to this document online, for each of the points that you see here under the three categories, recycling text ethically and appropriately, recycling text legally, and recycling text transparently. If you put your mouse over each one of those points, it will open up a new, not a new window, but sort of a new area in the document that provides additional explanation as well as specific advice for how to do it. Under recycling text ethically and appropriately, you'll see, if you take a look at this, I'm not sure how well you can all see this on your screens, but there are 3 bullet points there. And we've divided this up into authors should recycle text in point 1 under these circumstances. Authors may recycle text under these other circumstances and with these conditions. And then thirdly, authors should be careful not to recycle text in ways that mislead readers or editors. One of the things that we've been trying to do is not necessarily to strictly encourage authors or researchers to recycle text willy-nilly, but to understand that there may in fact be ways and times in which recycling text is the best possible choice that a researcher or an author can make under certain circumstances. Recycling text legally has to do with some of the issues having to do with copyright and contracts that we address very briefly here. And recycling text transparently encourages researchers to be very, very transparent with the editors or the publishers that they are going to be submitting articles to that do include some recycled text. Next document. The next document we produced is Understanding Text Recycling, a Guide for Researchers. And this is one in which we sort of go much more deeply and richly and fully into what it is that text recycling is and how we developed and came to the guidelines and policies that we were recommending. We address the issue of terminology. We talk about the different types of text recycling, but we also talk about some special cases. And these are cases that made up a lot of our conversation in the recycling, in the text recycling research group about how to handle them, how to think about them, and what to do with them. Proceedings were one kind of publication that became an issue because in some disciplines, proceedings are considered to be in some ways official publications, the same as a journal article would be. But in other disciplines, proceedings are a kind of quick representation of a work that is still in progress. Dissertations were another issue under discussion, as well as preprints, which are publications that are becoming much more prevalent in the STEM disciplines. And the STEM disciplines needed some guidance about the extent to which these would be considered official publications or the extent to which they could be considered generative recycling, something that was a kind of work in progress. And then lastly, we address the issue of authorship and permission. Suzanne touched on this a little bit in her presentation. saying that in some cases where you have recycling between two articles that have identical authors, sometimes in multiple combinations, that presents a different kind of case from articles in which you have a large number of authors and only some of which may appear across publications. Okay, next. In keeping with addressing the second audience for editors and publishers, we created a document that is Understanding Text Recycling, a Guide for Editors. This is in some ways very close to or akin to the documents that we produced for researchers, but you'll see, especially under types of TR, we pull out the section on generative recycling, which has to do with recycling from one publication to another publication. We not only talk about some of the issues having to do with copyright and the like, but we talk about alternatives that some of the editors that we interviewed suggested might be appropriate ways to avoid text recycling, such as just quoting everything, rewording or patch writing texts, or summarizing previous texts very quickly and referring to source documents. We talk about these in a much fuller way than we've been able to in some of the other documents, mostly pointing out the fact that these alternatives are not always or even very frequently practical or useful when it comes to thinking about how to deal with text recycling. We address the issue of authorship a little bit more fully, attribution and transparency. We talk about publication status. Again, this is something that Suzanne referred to, and whether or not in a particular discipline or context, a source document would be considered a publication as opposed to a work in progress. And then finally, we address in some form the issues of legality, fair use, copyright, and the like, but not as in quite so full a manner as we do in the next document, which I'll show you, which is a white paper that was put together primarily by Carrie and by David Hansen that talks about text recycling and research writing, US copyright law and fair use. And this is a very detailed examination of copyright law, how it applies to text recycling, and discussing the issue of fair use in a US context and how that might affect editors and publishers' understandings of what might be considered to be appropriate or ethical or legal recycling between documents. Next. These are some of the documents that we are currently working on and producing. The one that we're most immersed in right now has to do with creation of model policies for text recycling and model language for author-publisher contracts that address text recycling issue. The model policies will provide editors and publishers with a range of possible options that they can choose from, depending upon their discipline, their journal, and in some cases, their preferences. But we're also trying to limit the number of possible choices that they have so that the choices that are available best fit with the research that we've done and the best practices that we're trying to advocate. In the future, what we'll be doing is looking at some of the educational documents that we can produce that might be useful in classrooms or in writing centers, or possibly, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, for writing across the curriculum programs. Two documents that we have envisioned, neither of which we have started on just yet, one of which is student FAQs on text recycling, and also a document that talks about best practices for students. And then for the larger document that we're going to be working on over the course of the next year is a full white paper about text recycling that will get as deep into the weeds as anybody could possibly want to delve in relation to the text recycling issue. Next. So the third phase, as I said before, is educational documents. We're in our fourth year, transitioning into the fifth, and we're looking to develop educational materials that can be used in WAC contexts, including faculty development programs and training, research integrity training, graduate courses, writing classes, writing centers, and other possible contexts that we have not yet determined. And in fact, this is perhaps segueing into the next phase of this session, which is to open it up for suggestions, advice, comments, questions. What is it that we need to produce as a research group? and what materials would be most useful or effective in some of the contexts that we've listed here, or that you could possibly imagine that we haven't yet considered. So this is our invitation to conversation. Any aspect of the project you would like to ask us about, previous research studies, results, policies, guidelines, documents, future work, we invite your comments and questions. And Suzanne, did you want to show the last slide, the further reading, which mostly directs you to the publications page on the website and provides access to all of the publications and resources that we have produced thus far.
So Jeff already asked a question in the chat, and I'll just answer it briefly. No, the algorithm ignores stuff that's quoted because it's quoted, right?
There's a second question there that's a follow-up.
Let's see, most scholars build on articles they've written either based on grants or books they have written. User analysis of kinds of material was recycled and have contributed to new thinking. The algorithm doesn't do that kind of work for us. It essentially creates matches based on a certain patterns of word, but we also have to disregard stuff that is boilerplate, right? Because that happens. I mean, there's certain sequences of words that will appear across large numbers of texts. So the algorithm had to be programmed to avoid that kind of material as well. And it's difficult because you sometimes have to hand separate that stuff out, right?
The reason I asked that question is that, like for our book that we were working on with Dan and Michelle, we wrote the book and then we wrote an article to present a piece of that book, and then we wrote an article that extended the book beyond what we were doing. So it's just an example of what scholars do in our field. And so the first article was not a total rehash, but it was a lot of material that got repackaged, but it was purposeful. The second one was little segments of material so that we could provide context, but then we carried it into a very different direction. And so my question, so that to me seems like a really rich area for consideration. How is the material being used, and is it being used for you mentioned this, when I think someone mentioned this early, is it being used to generate new knowledge? Is that an area that's possible to explore?
It's kind of an interesting question. One of the original sets of questions that we asked on our first survey had to do with asking opinions about whether or not it was appropriate to recycle from one genre to another. So we would say, is it appropriate to recycle material from a poster presentation into a journal article, or is it appropriate to do it from one journal article into another? And we collected information about their attitudes in terms of whether or not it was acceptable or not, but we didn't get any sense at all of the frequency with which this sort of thing happened. And it's probably not surprising that we wouldn't be able to do so because we don't have access to some things like the poster presentations that they gave, or in some cases, the early grant proposal that was written that became the basis of a later journal article. So I know that in Chris and Ian's work, the only thing that they were able to look at in terms of being able to understand the quantity or the rhetorical placement of some of these texts was by looking at articles that had been published as a result of the work that came out of these NSF grants. We didn't have access to anything that came before.
One more simple follow-up, which would be, if you chose, you could do what I was just suggesting, look at a book that a scholar writes, and then any articles that spin off from that book, and look at that over and see, because you could get a lot more information in that kind of process.
Well, that's where you get a lot of ambivalence, and in our interview data and survey data, where editors and others will say, well, as Michael pointed out, it depends on the context and the purpose and the genre and what you're doing with it. The other people are more purist. They say, well, you can go ahead and use the material, but put it in different words. That's a different thing than using it differently rhetorically, right? So, for example, the method sections in IMRAD formula kinds of articles are often recycled, because why would you write them over again? Right? And I think, and Suzanne and Michael, who have deeper knowledge of the qualitative results, may want to step in here, but I think that editors were more okay with that kind of part of the text than with interpretations and analysis and results. So it depends on the kind of stuff as well that's being recycled.
Yeah, that was definitely the case, that the greatest consensus was around generative recycling, journal article to journal article, that methods was the area of least contention, although still you would find some people who had concerns about that. They would think this is copyright violations, so you can't do it for that reason, or they were hardliners and they just said you shouldn't ever do this. They had this deep sense that it was unethical, and that's what we're trying to push back against that. Like, why should it be unethical to repeat? If you did the same thing, you used the same instrument, you went to the same place, why do you need to describe it in new words? That actually makes research less clear across a career or a line of research. Let's see, Eric, you're at the top of my list with your hand raised. Do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, just briefly, I know that this focus is mostly on STEM, but has there been much research done on, non-STEM? So like in literature and humanities and that sort of thing, because that's what I teach. And, I inevitably get papers from different classes because I know the prompts in a lot of other classes where it's pretty obvious that the student just took a paper for one class and, put it in mine. And so, I'm just curious if there's been much research done in non-STEM fields.
So for the attitudes and beliefs part of the study, which was about writing for publication, not about classroom writing, that did go across disciplines. So if you look at that paper and you're seeing those attitudes of the journal editors and editorial boards, they're thinking about their peers and not their students. So that may bear on your question, but I think Chris is probably the one he's leading the charge on really looking at the pedagogical piece. And Chris, your study what are you getting in terms of responses disciplinarily? Do you know yet?
They're overwhelmingly in composition and writing so far. There's scattered responses from people in different disciplines, but that's something that we have to increase. So I'm going to look for ways to get that survey out to folks in other areas, because I'm really interested to see if it varies pedagogically.
Yeah, maybe people in this group have colleagues that could help you do that. Paula, you're the next one on the list here.
Hi, and thanks much for all the resources and information here. I guess my question is really about ideologies of language and how they're operating here and how you're tapping into them in surveys. Coming from a basically dialogic or Bakhtinian perspective, all texts are recycled. We're always using words that exist in the language that other people use. I would guess that function words and common lexical choices would hit 10% in most fairly long texts. So there's got to be some definition here of what constitutes strings that are problematic. And I think in STEM fields in particular, it's clear that oftentimes there aren't other words to give for sometimes like 3, 4, 5, 6 word noun phrases that represent technical concepts. I mean, if you're talking about neutrons, electrons, and positrons, you're talking about neutrons, electrons, and positrons. You don't say little things, or So I guess my question is, when you say that text recycling is material that's recycled, how are you defining material?
Well, I'll just briefly mention how the algorithm works. It doesn't look for strings that are short, because what you find is the longer the string, the less likely it is that it's going to be boilerplate, right? So it's looking for a certain length limit, or lengths of or strings of text. But that's a good question, right? How far do you go with that?
I mean, I can say how I think about this. I don't know if this will feel like a very satisfactory answer to your very good question, but I think about it in terms of our composing practices. So how are you creating a text? Are you going back to something you wrote in the past and copying and pasting it into a new text, or looking at it and retyping the words that you typed before? Or are you sitting down with a blank screen and generating language? And so I think that the heart of this project really is in those pragmatics of how do we help researchers and students think about what to do when they're composing a text, and when they might be going into territory that publishers or instructors will deem to be unethical, which might not evolve felt unethical to the author who is producing the text. And how can we make sure everyone knows where those lines are and that those lines have been drawn in a really considered way? So I think your question has very clear implications for how do you set an algorithm, but in terms of how I think about what the aims of the projects are, it's really about how do we give folks instructions for composing new text based on all the reading and everything they've done before. But yeah, that's a great question.
I'll also say that at the point when we were doing some fairly detailed text analysis of the transcripts of the interviews that we had, we met as a group and talked about this issue having to do with disciplinary tropes, that there are certain sort of combinations of words and ways to express disciplinary concept that seem to be replicated frequently within the same article and also frequently across articles in the same genre and discipline. So I think that this was something that Chris was also privy to in those conversations, is thinking about to what extent do we want to try to identify or tease those out specifically, or do we want to follow a path, which I think Chris and Ian ended up doing in their algorithm, which is to look at longer patterns and sequences of text so that we would circumvent sort of the replication of relatively brief passages and having those identified as text recycling.
Just to add to that briefly before we go to Christina, Paul, your question also, we've been discussing the potential for an article that considers, from a social practices position, that considers kind of communities of practice, and how the results of this study might complicate our received notions of communities of practice having some level of coherence and sort of discursive agreement about things, because there isn't, right? If you think about those disciplinary practices, they're varied responses. Well, there isn't coherence there necessarily. The values aren't the same. So I'm interested in doing something on, the old sort of notion of a discourse community or communities of practice, and how this study sort of pressures those assumptions about how those are formed within particular disciplinary groups.
Christina, you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. This work is so fascinating. I think both at the level of professional writing practices, as well as it seems more relevant now than ever for our students coming out of a pandemic. This reminds me of a conversation I was seeing, if folks are familiar with the Facebook group on rhetoric and composition and writing studies pedagogy. Folks were talking about, and I had never considered it in this light before, how text recycling, well, I don't want to I'm sorry to contaminate your survey potentially, but talking about how this might be even more ethical in light of students having more difficulty, at least at my institution, the number of students retaking first year writing really sharply shot back up. And I had never thought about it in those terms before, in terms of how it might really serve the students who didn't finish the course, withdrew, and need to retake it, and what are the ethical lines for reuse. So I want to thank you for opening that conversation. And just to speak from my personal experiences with collaborating with scientific writing, I'm just so fascinated that you weren't seeing really hard patterns, Michael and Susan, along discipline, when you mentioned along disciplinary lines. For instance, multi-aim studies are so common, particularly because the word counts are so much shorter, right? The genres are different. So a journal article can't possibly contain all of what you might do with one set of data that's been analyzed. So I was on a team where we analyzed a corpus of videos, and then it became 2 different quantitative and 1 qualitative paper. And so the methods, have many passages that are the same. And like you've mentioned before, it wouldn't have made sense for us to rewrite those methods. Or at least not the beginning of them, because it was all from the same data analysis. So anyway, I just find this really generative and interesting, and I look forward to seeing what else you do with it.
Some editors are concerned that there's accuracy lost when you try to rewrite. They want it to be accurate. They're okay with it being replicated.
Yeah, one thing we haven't touched on too much today is just what do you do if you don't recycle text, right? So we talked about patch writing, just telling people to lightly reword their own language, or another, and we wrote about a piece about this too that's linked on our site. We didn't mention it today, but you could refer someone back to, like, go over to this paper here and it says what my methods are. But the way academic publishing works is your readers might not have access to that other paper, right? It's not easy to get over there. You're not going to have a huge quotation. That's not the discourse mode in really any field, but particularly not in STEM fields. So there's not a good alternative where you can say, well, we don't like this, let's do this instead. So that's part of why we're trying to make at least some kinds of text recycling, help people realize that they could promote clarity of communication and efficiency. And if we do this thoughtfully and with a lot of transparency, it could be a useful practice. Jeff, did you have something else?
Yeah, two comments and a suggestion. So the comment is, in terms of text recycling for students, if they're using their previous texts and they're paraphrasing, paraphrase is a whole nother thing. Paraphrase is still an ethical problem if it's not quoted, whereas in a published work, paraphrase is a standard practice, especially in APA strategies, whatever. And so that question of the difference between paraphrase and text recycling seems to me a generative area to consider. That was a comment. And so my other, you had asked earlier, and I think we kind of moved away from it, what might be another area to explore? And I suggested maybe taking a look at the AP Press posts, because AP, creates a lot of generative articles that then become longer pieces and all these other articles. Because it's a standard practice, I don't know that it'll be that useful for you, but I was just curious of what you thought about it.
We haven't ranged outside of academic research writing at all. So I think, so you're talking about the Associated Press, right? Yeah, I think that's, I was talking with a journalist because we recently had a piece about this project in Science, and then our respective institutions were covering that. And so just talking with someone who's a professional, a strategic communicator about this, it was interesting, and a whole new world opened up of like, that's a whole new, someone needs to get a grant and do that, I think. It's a great idea. I think we should probably wrap up to give people a few minutes of a break here. So I just want to thank my co-presenters, as well as everyone who took time out of their day to join us today. I know all of us who presented would be happy to continue the dialogue in any way that we could. And as, again, it's such a hands-on and pragmatic project, we've learned a lot from talking with people who have questions or about their own writing or teaching. So do feel free to reach out, and thank you.